Hello and welcome to a new video. As much as I enjoy summer, I am definitely happy that the super hot days are gone and we are slowly moving into the fall. For me, this also means that I enjoy my time in the kitchen a lot more because there is no sweating, at least not from the hot temperatures, and I'm more likely to use the oven, or at least I don't feel bad for using it because it's no longer heating up the house insanely. I call this video meal prepping for the week, but it's not your typical meal prepping kind of thing. The meal prep I do, or I still consider it meal prepping, is preparing certain ingredients, usually different kinds of meat, and then I have those ready to cook with throughout the week. But I'm doing a few more things here. There is some meat as well, but I'm actually starting with a pie, an apple pie, because of course apples are now in season and we brought some home from our vacation house. So I'm making this yeast dough, or at least that's how what Google Translate told me it translates to. So in Czech we have these kinuté těsto, which, as I said, Google translated to yeast dough. I'm not sure how much that is really used in English, but oh well. Basically, this dough is going to rise, and I am going to add yeast to it, and it's going to rise before I make it into the pie. So I started off with melting some butter, and then I'm mixing the ingredients for the pie dough. First, I put all the flour I will need into the big bowl, and I then make like a little dip in it, and into that I put a little bit of sugar and milk, and then I kind of dribble in the fresh yeast that I'm using, and I'll also use just like a little scoop of my sourdough starter, because those two are basically the same thing. They are both yeast. So I'm using both. I guess in theory I could use only my sourdough starter, but I have never done a dough like this with only the starter, so I still want to use the active yeast to make sure that it rises properly and quickly enough. Like this, I let it stand on the side for about 10 minutes until the active yeast starts working a little bit. And while that's happening, I can get my chicken ready. So very often I get a whole chicken, I bake the chicken in the oven, take the meat off the bones, pick it off the bones, and then use the bones to make some bone broth, which I then use for all sorts of things, mostly soups, but also into different sauces, into rice instead of water, for example, and just lots of different things. So cooking a whole chicken for me is always a good start to the week. You can see that something has started happening with the yeast, like it's a little bit more bubbly, but this is fine. We can work with this. It is, of course, going to make the dough rise later. So I'm adding the rest of the ingredients into it. There is egg yolks that go into it, a little bit of salt, a little bit more sugar, and the milk, the melted butter that I had on the side. And then I have to work the dough a little bit. I don't have like a stand mixer or anything like that, so I'm doing this by hand, which is it is a little bit of work, and I am sweating even though the house is quite cool, and my hand definitely hurts, but it always surprises me that there isn't all that much work that needs to be done with this particular recipe. So I've actually tried to do it by hand as well. That was definitely a mistake. I should have just kept to the wooden spoon in the bowl. As you can see, it was just sticking everywhere. But as soon as I put it back into the bowl, and I only did like 2 or 3 scoops or movements with the spoon, the dough became really nice and smooth pretty much immediately, so that was great to see. And since I've used this recipe many times before, I know that even if it's not like perfectly worked through, it's going to work. The dough is going to rise, so I know I don't have to worry about this process too much. So I'll then cover the bowl with a tea towel and let the dough rise for about 2 hours, or more, kind of like until I have time to work with it. So if it's 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours even, that's fine. I then get started on some bread as well. That's always at least once a week thing for me. It's always great to have bread, whether it's for eggs in the morning or just as like a little snack, or to go with dinner, to go with like a soup to make it more of a standalone meal. Anything like that, bread is great for. And I've already done a couple videos in my sourdough series, so if you are curious about the bread recipe that I'm using, I will link that video up on the screen for you. And then it's on to the apples for the apple pie. And as you can see, like, they are definitely not the prettiest apples in the world. They have fallen from the tree, or we've seen lots of wasps eating all the apples, but they're not like completely spoiled. I can just cut out the bad parts and they will be perfectly fine for this kind of pie. I wouldn't eat these just on their own, but in a pie like this, they work pretty well. So I am peeling all of them, I'm cutting them up, and then I'm actually grating them. And I'm not, often you will see people suggest to put some lemon juice on them so that they don't get brown. But again, I don't mind them not being pretty and being brown instead. They will be covered with some crumble anyways on the top. So, and it doesn't really change the taste. At least I don't think it does. So I'm not doing any of that, just grating them in the bowl and leaving them as is. And the chicken got done in the middle of me grating the apples, so I'm taking it out of the oven, letting it cool, and then a little bit later you will see me pick all the meat off the bones. Once the apples are ready, I can get back to my bread. I'm adding my salt and cumin into it, and then a little bit later doing a few stretch and folds. As I mentioned, to finish off this pie, there will be a crumble on top, so I am mixing some flour. I'm using this kind of flour that I'm not sure if other countries have, but basically our all-purpose flour is also divided into 3 categories based on how like coarsely milled it is. And for the crumbles, you always want to use the one that's a little bit more grainy, not the one that's super smooth, just so that it, I guess, sticks better to the butter and everything. So I'm using that, I'm using sugar and some butter, mixing it all up, and then setting that to the side. At this point, the dough is super fluffed up, it's nice and elastic, and I am very simply just flipping it onto my baking tray, which I covered with a baking sheet, and then just using my hands, I'm spreading the dough on the whole sheet. You want to be careful so that you don't tear the dough, but I found that this amount works perfectly well with this sheet, and I never really run into any issues with it tearing up or anything. There's always enough dough to cover the entire thing. So it just takes a little bit of time because, of course, as the dough is elastic, it just wants to spring back to its original bowl shape. So you do have to push it quite forcefully, I would say, into all the corners and all the sides. Once I do that, I then lay all the grated apples on top of it, and then I sprinkle it with the crumble. It goes into the oven until the edges are nice and golden. And here it is. And for me, this really is my absolute favorite kind of pie. I also like different toppings on it. You actually saw me use a recipe from a cookbook for this. But what you might have noticed in the cookbook that there is something red on top of the pie, not apples, and that is rhubarb. So I love doing this with rhubarb as well, but I could imagine that this could work with some other fruits as well. Like you can literally just, I don't know, put apricots, put strawberries if you want, put maybe pears would work as well. Like really a lot of things, cherries, I mean, anything will work on top of this. And this kind of full sheet of a pie is going to last my family of just me, my partner, and our 1.5-year-old baby for a good 3 days for our breakfasts. And this is already the evening of that same day. I guess I didn't film me picking the chicken meat off the bone. So here, the only last thing that I'm doing here is putting the bread dough into the bread proofing basket, and then that goes into the fridge. The next day, on a Tuesday in the morning, I baked the bread, and then I actually got started on the broth. So I didn't make it on the same day as the chicken. I kept both the chicken meat and the chicken bones in the fridge. So I'm taking the chicken bones from the fridge, and in the freezer, I have these very handy vegetable packages where I've got some carrots, some parsley, and the bulb celery. So I have a few of those. I put those into the pot. I also put some onion. I think here I used shallots because I didn't have regular yellow onion, and the shallots work just as well. So I put those in, put water in, of course, and some spices as well, bay leaf and allspice. And I'm slowly boiling that for a good couple of hours, 4, 5, 6 hours, anything like that is great. I'm then pouring some of it into these containers, which I'm then freezing so that I have some frozen broth. Again, just to use this usually is not for soups because it's a little bit of a smaller quantity, let's say, but this is great into the sauces, for example, where you only need like 100 milliliters, 200 milliliters of the broth. I'll just take out 1 or 2 of these cubes and they work great. So I put some into this cube tray, and then the rest goes into these mason jars, and they go into the fridge where they will last for a couple weeks, but usually they are gone within a week or 2. And the last sort of meal prep item is again a piece of meat. And this you've seen me do before in the food to go video where I made the pulled pork. I said in that video we really liked it, and I'm definitely gonna do this again. And so it didn't take me long until I got to try it again. But I have to say, I was quite upset with our butcher, because I went into the butcher's, I told them I want to make pulled pork. So, well, here's the thing, I should start with this. I didn't remember what cut of meat I used in that first try I did of the pulled pork. I didn't really want to Google. I was just thinking, I'll just ask them. I'm sure they will know what's best for this. And they didn't know. They said they have no experience with that, and they basically didn't give me any advice. So I just picked some, like a bigger cut of pork meat. And you will see in the end, it definitely wasn't ideal because, or at least I don't think it was, because what you want with pulled pork is the muscles that have the short strings, right? So it pulls apart nicely. Well, this one had like the really long ones, and yeah, I'm just not experienced with all the different meat cuts enough to remember which kinds of meat have which types of or maybe like the muscle fibers or something. So I was a little bit upset with them. I definitely need to find a new butcher place to go to, because this wasn't the first time that they were unhelpful and just in general not very knowledgeable about the meat that they sell. So anyways, the taste was fine, so that was good. So what I did is I just salted the meat, and then I seared it on some high temperature with some lard. And once the meat was seared on all sides, I took the meat out and I added in some onion and a little bit of garlic. And then to kind of complete the sauce, I also added a little bit of honey, some barbecue sauce, and I got to use a little bit of that chicken broth that I made just earlier in the day. I put the meat back in, and then it was cooking, covered for, again, like a good 4 hours to make it fall apart easily. Then I took it out, I pulled all the meat apart, and I increased the temperature to a really high, and I kind of cooked down the rest of the sauce, and then I returned the meat into that pot to make sure that it gets completely covered in that sauce. And then it went into the fridge and we got to enjoy it throughout the week. So these were some of my tips or things that I do that I would consider meal prepping. I hope you found some of these things helpful and that you will try some of it, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.